Welcome to the Oral History Podcast, which features stories from the oral history website voicesofoklahoma.com, where Oklahomans have given generously of their time to tell their life story for present-day listeners and for the generations to come. Our entire collection is available at voicesofoklahoma.com. By subscribing to our podcast, you will be notified of new Oklahoma oral history podcasts. So now listen to another interesting storyteller from voicesofoklahoma.com.
Lee Roy West has made several thousand friends in over 40 years of public service as a law teacher, state court judge, member of the Civil Aeronautics Board, federal judge, and breeder and trainer of national champion bird dogs. Born in Clayton, Oklahoma, Judge West graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a bachelor's degree and a law degree. He was a Marine Corps lieutenant and earned his Master of Law degree from Harvard. Even though the West family was poor economically, they were wealthy in many important areas, including humor, wisdom, and friendships. Lee West's major contribution to Oklahoma and the nation may be his teaching that life is supposed to be fun. It's not just okay to have fun, it's required. Many say West's most endearing trait is to teach those with whom he deals how to be a good friend. Judge West is a wonderful storyteller, as you will hear in this oral history account of his life, made possible by foundations and listeners like you who believe in preserving our state's legacy one voice at a time on voicesofoklahoma.com.
My name is John Erling. Today's date is April 27, 2011. Judge West, will you state your full name, please, your date of birth, and your present age?
My name is Lee R. West, Leroy, actually, and then my birth certificate reflects it as Leroy, L-E-R-O-Y, so there's a bit of confusion, but my payroll signature has always been Lee R. West, but I usually go by Lee. I am a senior judge on the Western District of Oklahoma. I was appointed in 1979 by President Jimmy Carter, and I now serve as a senior judge after retiring from an active role. I still have a full staff, and I still carry a reduced workload, but come to the office every day.
Give us your birth date and your present age.
November the 26th, 1929, which makes me 81. I'll be 82 in November.
And where are we recording this interview?
We're recording it in my chambers in the federal courthouse in Oklahoma City.
Where were you born?
A place called Bobtown in Pushpataha County, but it was really just a small part of Clayton, which is pretty small itself, very small place. Clayton in Pushpataha County, Oklahoma in 1929.
What part of the state is that?
That's far southeast, Little Dixie.
And we'll get into why they call it Little Dixie.
Sure.
You know, tell us your mother's name, maiden name, where she was born, where she grew up.
Her name was Nicey Hill. When she married my father, it was West. She was born in Arkansas, near a small town called Blue Ball, Arkansas, which I've been to, but it just barely exists at this time.
She grew up there then?
She grew up and married my father. I can't remember exactly the year. He was born in 1890, and I would guess around 1910 or something like that. He had been married and was divorced, and then she married him after, it was early in the 1900s.
What was your mother like? What was her personality like?
She, everybody thinks their mother was a great person, but my mother was truly a wonderful person. She could barely read or write, went all the way to the third grade, but I don't think completed that. But she was the most protective and loving parent that anyone could have, certainly that I've ever been around. She was sort of the sole moral beacon that we had in our group. My father was a bit of a philanderer and all that sort of thing, a horse trader and a bootlegger, but she was solid. And like I say, every day of my life, I grow just a little more respectful and fond of my mother.
So she gave you the compass in life?
Oh, absolutely. Coped with the most rigorous conditions. We were very poor. They had a saying, we were too poor to paint and too proud to whitewash. I didn't even live in a home that had indoor plumbing until I went to the University of Oklahoma in 1948. We never had very much, but she coped very well to provide I don't feel deprived at all by coming from a very poor background. My father could neither read nor write, so there was never anything in excess, but we survived amazingly well.
You had brothers and sisters.
I have two sisters who are now deceased, two older sisters. They were wonderful. My slightly older brother, 2 years older, was killed in an automobile accident shortly after I got out of law school, so he's been gone some time. And then I had two half-sisters. My mother and my father had both been previously married, so I had two half-sisters and two half-brothers, all a good bit older than I am.
Weren't you the first one to be born in a house?
I was. My full brothers and sisters were all three born while we were living in what we called a top wagon. It wasn't a schooner. It was just a regular-sized wagon with hoops and a canvas over the top. My dad was an itinerant horse trader, and we just sort of traveled a good part of the year trading and going to wheat harvest or something like that. They did. And all my immediate brothers and sisters were born in that top wagon without the assistance of medical doctor or anything. So I was the privileged one. When I was born in Bobtown, there was a doctor in attendance at my home, Dr. John Lawson. So I've always been accused of being the privileged member of that family.
It's hard to imagine. Only the strong survived back then. You think about these babies born in a top wagon, and now today...
It's almost unbelievable, to me even. My siblings have given me a hard time about that down through the years, as a matter of fact.
Then your father, his full name and where he grew up.
He didn't have a middle name, just Calvin West, and he was born in 1890 in Arkansas at or near the Petit Jean Mountain. It was a pretty good clan. His father was one of 7 children that were descendants from Owen West, who is the old pioneer cabin you see on Petit Jean Mountain if you go to that state park over there. He never did attend school. He was an animal lover, a horse trader from the beginning, never learned to read or write except he could barely draw his name. As a matter of fact, I have a document in which he used an X to mark his name. He was completely illiterate, but not unintelligent. He was a surprisingly bright fellow for someone who could neither read nor write.
This is an aside because I knew people who lived in Petit Jean Mountain, and it was the Davies family. And Papa Ladd Davies was a name. He's since deceased, and his children, David Davies, and another son is the director of tourism today in Arkansas. I don't know if that rings a bell with you at all.
It doesn't particularly, but we have attended a few gatherings in the autumn. They have a gathering at Petit Jean Mountain. And my sister and my niece and I and my wife have attended a couple of 3 of those, and I may have very well met them, but I don't recall them, John.
So your father was a horse trader, cattleman?
Small-time cattleman. He had small herds of cattle from time to time. And then he evolved during the war into primarily bootlegging, selling whiskey and running what we call honky-tonks, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, dance halls. He did not sell moonshine, if at all, very little, because he was very concerned about the federal revenuers. If you bought a federal stamp, you were not prosecuted by the federal government, even if you sold bonded whiskey. But if you did sell moonshine, you could be prosecuted by the feds, and he was very concerned about that because that meant real time. Of course, what he did, selling bonded in bond whiskey, as we call it, he was in pretty constant, well, not pretty constant, very constant violation of the state law. But they had a system in eastern Oklahoma, as you know, of forgiveness and so forth if certain political contributions and regular payments to relatives and so forth took place. So he sort of engaged in that from about the time the war started, World War II, we're talking about, till it was completed.
So you and Barry Switzer have something in common.
Barry and I have a great deal in common, and he's a very good friend of mine.
Barry Switzer, of course, his book, Bootlegger's Boy, and I've interviewed him in this, and he talks much about his father and has tremendous respect about his daddy, as he calls him. even though he was involved in all this.
Well, I've never quit craving my father's approval, although we had, some pretty serious disagreements, particularly as I got older and supposedly a lot smarter. And he was killed when I was a freshman in the University of Oklahoma in a tornado, and I've often regretted that I didn't do a better job of communicating with him and forgiving him, as my mother was able to do always. She did that a lot better than I did.
This is remarkable. You could have fallen in with a wrong crowd back then, and there was something upstairs here that said, no, this is the wrong way, and I need to get out of here.
I don't have any idea what it was. It was perhaps luck. But I attributed an awful lot of that to my wanting to get an education and get a better life through education. I think that was the biggest motivation of any, is that early on I developed a voracious reading habit. It enlightened me, as you know from reading, as you're a reader, it just enlightened me to all sorts of possibilities that were never a part of the discussion, me or my friends even very much back then.
Did your mother, she had a short education, did she talk about high school and college and wanting you to move on?
Never a doubt in her mind. They were both, even though my father could neither read nor write, they were both very encouraging about me attempting to improve myself through education. My dad used to say, if you don't get an education, you'll wind up just like I am. And she, on the other hand, had no doubt. I was pretty doubtful, but she didn't. She said, you're as bright and as smart. And, of course, she thought brighter and smarter than anyone else. You can do exactly what you want to as far as getting an education. And that was very encouraging.
Then there comes a point where your family moves from Clayton to Blanchard.
Very briefly, right during the depths of the Depression, my dad had sort of faltered, as everybody had, on crops and what few cattle we had. So we all loaded up in a bobtail truck. I got to ride in the front. My other brothers and sisters had to just kind of snuggle down in all the covers and bedding and everything, and drove to Blanchard. For what reason it was selected, I'll never know. Our fortunes did not improve any in Blanchard right during that. So I can remember to this day, my dad could not pay for the truck. And they came and recovered it, and he had a few horses that he was trading on, trying to make a living. As I now understand, and then understood pretty well, he had them all mortgaged. All the horses were mortgaged, and he traded on them and sold them. Before very long, we weren't in Blanchard more than about a year, a little over a year. The horses were all gone, and the banks had not been paid. So he was in violation of the law for selling mortgaged property. So we headed back to southeastern Oklahoma in a wagon, another top wagon with 2 horses. That's all we had. We got all the way to Tallahena. We're camped beside a creek. Now, it's surprising, but I can remember some of this pretty well. I was asleep, but the police from that county, the sheriff's office, they arrested my father and left my mother with 4 kids beside the creek out there with 2 horses and a top wagon and absolutely no income whatsoever. She was magnificent, of course. She moved us into a little cabin on an adjoining place there by permission of the landowners, who furnished us the opportunity to get into the garden and even put us to work at a sorghum mill in exchange for food and stuff like that. And hitchhiked all over southeastern Oklahoma to raise enough money to make bail for my father. And this was among friends who didn't have anything either, and it was a very great chore. But she finally bailed him out, and then we moved on to Antlers. We attended school in Tallahena, but only for a short period of time.
This memory of your father being arrested there, about 6 or 7 years old, you would have been?
I was.
That had to be a frightening.
I was in the 2nd grade at Tallahena when that happened, but we moved on to Antlers, and I enrolled in the 2nd grade, so I was 7 years old at the time.
That had to be a frightening experience.
It was. It was disturbing now, but as I say, my mother was so wonderful that she never did let us think of giving up. She was always, it's kind of a confusing time, but we're gonna we were going to make it. And sure enough, we did.
You were a hunting enthusiast, and we'll get into that later, but back then for entertainment, you probably were out shooting rabbits and squirrels.
We hunted in wood and gathered vegetables in neighboring garden where they permitted us to. We worked in the sorghum mill. I remember the little cabin we lived in had no screens of any kind, no doors even. I mean, it was just a vacant cabin that we could get in out of the rain. But, you know, we had 3 siblings, and we all enjoyed each other, and my mother was a delight to be around. So it wasn't all that bad, believe it or not.
Does your mother refer to these rabbits as
Hoover hogs? When we were in Blanchard, primarily, there was an abundance of jackrabbits running all over. They just kind of invaded the countryside. And at night, that was before we lost the truck, they'd drive out on the prairies and just shoot wash tubs full of jackrabbits. We'd bring them home, and she'd cook them and can them, and she referred to them as Hoover hogs because they were pretty critical of President Hoover along about that time, as you might imagine. It was a pretty tough time.
It was a tough time. The Depression was on, and you were, in a way, lucky you were living close to the land and thereby able to
get along pretty well.
So the first school you attended then, tell us about that.
That was at Clayton for just a short period of time, and then in Blanchard, which was a pretty unfortunate experience for me because there was a boy in there who regularly worked me over pretty good on the way home from school, and I just was terrified. I remember that I got some conflicting advice from my parents. My dad told me, said, if you'll fight that guy, he'll quit jumping on you. And my mother said, make friends with him, play with him, and he'll quit beating up on you. So I did both. I fought him, and then we started playing marbles and being friends, so he quit working on me. So I got along in school a lot better. I wasn't as scared of the teacher as I was. So I got along all right, but I had a bad experience that first year at Blanchard.
Did you shoot squirrel and eat squirrel?
Oh, we ate squirrels till they came out our ears all the time I was growing up, even through high school. Joe Packnett, who's my dear friend that used to be president of Oscar Rose out here, he and I squirrel hunted all through high school. We ate squirrel, we ate raccoon, we ate possum, we hunted everything that moved, had an old .22 pistol and a dog or two always at home. So we really provided, surprisingly enough, a good bit of the meat that we had.
As we like to say, did squirrel and possum taste just like chicken?
You know, my mother was a wonderful cook, of course, and she could fix it. She fixed squirrel and dumplings still as good as any chicken and dumplings that I've ever eaten. As a matter of fact, most people, hopefully, haven't eaten possum and sweet potatoes, but we regularly ate possum with sweet potatoes, and on a few occasions ate raccoon, which is not. But on one occasion, as a matter of fact, it was on the day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, we were hunting with a friend of ours, and we killed 3 squirrels and a chicken hawk, big chicken hawk, and his mother cooked all of that for our late lunch. Only time I can remember eating chicken hawk.
Yeah, you would have been 12 years old, December 7th, 1941. Right. And how did you first hear about that?
Well, as I say, we got up, my brother and I, and walked. It was about 5 miles down the railroad track to where our friend lived. He had these 2 dogs. I remember their names, Hitler and Mussolini, 2 blue tick hounds. We hunted all morning, and his mother fixed what we'd killed for lunch, and we walked back. And when we got back that night, at that time, we had gotten a radio. We owned a radio. My mother having gone to work for the WPA, all my relatives were listening intently to what had happened. I remember thinking the Japanese were very, very foolish to start a war with the United States, who I just thought would be absolutely invincible.
So at 12 years old, you felt that confident in your country. Some might have been afraid.
You know, being afraid didn't ever occur to me too much, although everybody was concerned about their relatives who were having to go into the war, and they become more concerned when the outcome, even to a 12-year-old boy, it became less clear that we were going to easily, because all of a sudden we were involved in wars in Europe as well. But I do remember, even before the war started, being much more concerned about what was going on in Germany and in Poland and in Europe, Russia, Finland, all of that, even at 12 years old, I was much more concerned about that. I had the normal, I guess, superior feeling that the Asiatics were not anywhere nearly our equals, and I learned, as we all have, that that's certainly not true. But Japan never did terrify me as ever being able to overrun us or beat us, but Germany certainly did.
Germany and Hitler, did they talk about that in school?
In school and in my home. I listened to the radio long before the Germans invaded Poland in 1939. I'd lie there and listen to my parents, and they'd talk in rather concerned and hushed tones about Germany and what Hitler was doing.
Even at that time, did you hear anything about concentration camps?
Not about the Holocaust. The first thing I remember about that is the taking of all the West Coast Japanese and putting them in camps. I remember thinking about that some, but no, I didn't really become aware to any great extent about the Holocaust until fairly late in the war. Our up-to-date news in Antlers was usually by movie tone news and that sort of thing. And then when we started finding all that, then I became fairly fully aware of what they were doing.
Do you recall people from the community then joining the war, leaving?
Everybody had a family member. One of my brothers, half-brothers, Bert, went into the service almost immediately, and everyone around town. And then, of course, we started losing some of those, and everybody was pretty concerned and saddened about that. And most of them were going to the Pacific Theater at that time. Later on, they got involved in the European combat.
You mentioned movie tones. You went to the theater? You saw movies?
Little town. They had 2 theaters in Antlers, Oklahoma.
Can you remember any of the movies or the stars you might have seen?
Of course, everybody remembers Gone with the Wind, saw that. Mostly, though, we were intrigued by any kind of a Western movie. My family was always involved with horses, so we loved all the Westerns. If we could drum up a dime, we'd never miss one. Usually sit through it twice if we could.
About your father, then, he owned bars. One was named the Rainbow Inn.
Rainbow Inn was probably the most notorious one. It was about 2 miles east of Antlers on the road to Rattan. It gained a good bit of notoriety because this was during the war, and the servicemen from Camp Maxey, Texas, which was just right near Paris, they were only 40 miles away. And Lamar County was dry down there. They couldn't even buy beer there. So they came to Oklahoma to get illegal bootleg whiskey and frequented this honky-tonk regularly. Had a good crowd.
Fights would erupt, I suppose?
Very frequent, almost nightly. Most of them were minor and could be just simply moved outside and played out, but occasionally they got pretty violent, even inside. I remember on one occasion, which I've recounted in the book, 2 fellows from Colgate, Oklahoma. They were huge guys. They're probably 6'1" or 6'2", but they were very athletic, muscular men. They came in, and there were sort of low rafters in this Rainbow Inn, and I remember being very impressed that they could jump and get a hold of a rafter and kind of swing a little bit ape-like, Well, they were sort of pursuing a local girl who was out there, and she became frightened, and she protested to my dad that they were coming on pretty strong. He went over to them and suggested that they ease off and leave her alone, and boy, a confrontation developed very quickly. My dad always had a pistol, a big old heavy pistol. He pulled that, and the bigger of these 2 guys rushed him into a booth, just bull rushed him into a booth and had him down under him and trying to take that gun away from him. And he twisted it so hard that my dad, holding on to the pistol grips, actually twisted the pistol grips off. He was in pretty bad shape, cut his finger very badly, and he was about in bad shape to lose the gun, lose the fight. But my oldest sister, full sister, Juanita, grabbed what we call a slapstick. It's a blackjack. This guy was over on my father in that booth, and she took about 4 or 5 roundhouse swings, just hitting him, clubbing him up beside the head and ear, and sort of dazed him and knocked him off of my father, who, when he came out from under there, he still had what was left of that pistol, and he really worked that guy over so badly. I've forgotten how many stitches, but they had to take 70 or 80 stitches in him after he was out. And in the meantime, there was an old gentleman that was a neighbor of ours who hung around up there all the time, and he was sort of an assistant bouncer, although he was pretty ancient. He had a Luger, I think it was a 9mm Luger pistol, and he engaged this smaller one of the two guys and hit him over the head with his pistol. And when he did, the pistol went off. Fortunately, it didn't hit anybody. It just went into the floor. But he hit that guy so hard that he fell to the floor and was sort of twitching. Everybody, we all thought he'd shot him and killed him. And as a matter of fact, my dad remarked, "Damn, John, did you have to shoot him?" And John Youngblood was the old man. And he said, "I didn't mean to, Cal." And he hadn't, really. After sufficient time, the old guy recovered, much to everyone's relief. But now that was a fight. I was just an 8 or 9 year old boy. And that was a violent fight that I'll never forget.
And you witnessed it?
Oh, witnessed it. Eyeballed, yeah.
Did you work in the bar?
Well, we sort of sold pops, and we didn't do too much conveying of the whiskey or anything. But later on, my dad had another little gambling joint out at the sale barn. My brother and I we were the house man. The way it worked, everybody anteed and everybody played, but the house man, whoever was putting on the game, would be able to cut just a small portion of the purse every time. And, of course, the house man usually wound up with all the money because he was getting a little bit every time. But anyway, we both did that. My brother was much better at that than I was. We did that until about the time I got out of high school.
Elementary through junior high, you enjoyed your work and you were a pretty good student?
Good student. At the time, I wasn't at all confident and sure of myself, but I was doing pretty well, and as I say, reading a great deal voraciously, as a matter of fact.
The summer before you entered high school, you were always a worker, weren't you?
Yeah, we had to work.
And you worked at the livestock auction?
Almost all small towns had a livestock auction, and we worked clearing the alleys and running the cattle in and out of the main area all summer long, and then went to school and worked part-time where we could.
Got bucked off a horse, too, I think.
Got bucked off many, many times, but one time in full view of everyone at the sale barn, all of whom were ranchers and farmers and friends of mine, and I, of course, wanted to be a cowboy. I was a wannabe cowboy. The auctioneer, who was a good friend and a character, he invited me to bust him off down there and roll him over and show what kind of action he has, and I did. I gouged him a little too deep with the spurs, and he bogged his head and threw me the full length of the bridle reins out there. And I don't think I've ever been as embarrassed at any time in my life since that, any more than I was at that time.
You enter high school, and that was a good experience?
Great experience. I got a little bit better and a little bit more confident as we went along.
You played football?
Played football, lettered 3 years in football. I lettered 3 years in basketball and 3 years in baseball. During my senior year, I was captain of the high school football team, which was to me a really significant honor. And I made all-district in football, and even got honorable mention for All-State.
How big a guy were you back then?
I weighed 166 pounds and was about 5'10". I've shrunk a little bit, but not in weight. I'd love to weigh 166 pounds now.
Bill Farr was an encourager to you?
Bill Farr was my math teacher and really a wonderful man. He was the first one who really tried to convince me that I had the intellectual capacity to go on to college. None of my family had gone to college, and none of my brothers and sisters had gone to college. It just hadn't even occurred to me, to tell you the truth. And he was the one that first planted the idea. I said, "You're bright and you read, and if you'll apply yourself, you can go to school just like any of these other people."
You lived in Antlers, and your parents lived elsewhere.
They moved down to a small town called Soper when I was a junior in high school. And I stayed simply because Antlers had a high school football team, and I was really enamored of that. My brother transferred to Sulphur and graduated down there. But I moved in with a family in Antlers whose son was the quarterback of our football team. He was a year, maybe 2 years ahead of me in school. I was working in a service station, and they offered to generously let me just move in, and I did. The father, he was called Hot Tamale Jim. He was part Mexican and part Portuguese. He butchered roosters and made them into hot tamales and pushed a little stand up and down the streets of Antlers and sold hot tamales. The mother, the wife, worked washing dishes and so forth in a small cafe. And the sister did also, who had been in our class, mine and Marianne's class earlier, but she dropped out. Outside my family, those were the kindest, most generous people.
And what was that family name?
Hernandez. Jim Hernandez was the father. Roy Hernandez was the son that was a good friend of mine. And our classmate was Fannie Mary Hernandez, and she is the mother of the state senator down there now, or was the state senator. He's no longer the state senator.
Your coach at Antlers was George Strickland.
George Strickland played at Oklahoma A&M basketball. He was from Atchlee and played for Mr. Iba. Never did play football. Well, a small school like Antlers, he coached football, basketball, and baseball. Wonderful man, good fella. We had some success in football and some success in basketball, but he was a good teacher and a good man, good role model.
Along about your junior year, you were dating somebody.
I started dating my bride of almost 59 years, Marianne. We had been in the same class since the second grade when I first moved there. I, of course, was enraptured almost immediately by her, and she didn't have any idea I even existed, and it was only after about 15 years of pursuing her that I got her to marry me when we were 22 after we got out of college. But we started dating in my junior year and then dated, until we got married. She went to Stevens for 2 years and graduated and then came back to OU. But that's been a lifelong love affair, and as the saying goes, I married up.
Yes.
Very much.
Remember back in those days listening to radio and certain programs and singers that you might remember?
I do remember that we had the one with the creaky door and Jack Benny, of course, and
would Amos and Andy have been on there?
Amos and Andy, we listened to Amos and Andy.
Was there a one-man's family?
One-man's family. We listened to that regularly.
Remember listening to news?
Yeah.
Was there a Gabriel Heater?
Gabriel Heater, frequently. And Movie Town News, we saw those whenever we were in the movie.
I don't know if Lowell Thomas was back then.
Lowell Thomas was on Movie Town News quite frequently, yeah.
Between your junior and senior year, the family moves to California.
They went to California. They really didn't move. My half-brother, Jack, who lived in Houston, a small town in the valley, San Joaquin Valley, we simply went out there to thin peaches, to get summer work. The whole family loaded up. That was in 1947, and we loaded up in a 36 Ford and all headed out to California, sleeping in the desert, to thin peaches. And we moved into a tent that we pitched in my brother's backyard. He had 5 children, and there were 4 or 5 of us, and we lived in that tent in his very modest house with 1 bathroom in it. So I know why people in California were absolutely appalled at the Okies, and that had preceded us since before John Steinbeck wrote. But at any rate, I can understand why they got the impression that this was just a deluge of bad, undesirable people. But we got through. It didn't work out too well financially because we all made pretty good money during the summer. But the car broke down twice on the way back home, and we had to expend almost all of our money in Needles and in Nocona, Texas. The car broke down both times, required comprehensive work on it, and I think I didn't even get a haircut all summer. I got to buy my 2 pair of overalls, I guess, before senior year started, is about all.
So are you thinking, I got to get out of this? You loved your family, though, and it was family, but were you thinking beyond that?
Well, I started to about that time. I really did. I didn't have any knowledge of any sort of academic scholarships, didn't even think about it, although I made the state and national honor societies in high school and did well, particularly in my junior and senior years. And I was offered a small partial athletic scholarship at Southeastern, but I always first wanted to go to Oklahoma State University and then to the University of Oklahoma, which was closer. So I just elected to try to do that on my own nickel because we had no funds. Worked for the highway department. Frank Fodge, a division engineer out there, gave us a job, and I think I was able to save $240 during the summer. Hitchhiked to Norman and got 2 jobs and enrolled with a total of $240 as the funding of my endeavors.
You graduated from high school in 1948, but we should mention there was a young lady by the name of Wilma Kaufman who was in your class.
She sits out there today as my receptionist, top sergeant, and manager, and has been a wonderful, close friend of mine and has worked for me as my administrative assistant for the last 26 years, I think it is.
Now Wilma House.
Now Wilma House. She married another friend of ours from Anders.
You wanted to attend OU. Wasn't that because you liked their football program?
Yeah, I started out being an OSU fan primarily because of Bob Fenimore and the wonderful success they were having during the war years. Then by the time I got out of high school, Tatum and Wilkinson had moved into the University of Oklahoma, and they were enjoying much success. And as I say, it was a little closer to home, so I switched loyalties and enrolled at OU.
While in OU, you worked in college. Also, you joined the Navy then.
Naval ROTC. I didn't know about that until after I got up there. But they had a program where if you could compete and win a scholarship, you'd get books, tuition, and $50 per month, which was pretty huge for me. So I took the competition and got that scholarship. I was still working at the Kappa Alpha House, earning my meals and so forth. So I was having a better lifestyle than I'd ever had in my life, living in a house with indoor plumbing. I was having the best time of my life.
Somewhere in there, a tornado affected your life.
While I was in high school, we had the terrible tornado the day FDR died that killed 83 different people in that small town of a little over 2,000 people. And that was a terrific, it just was unbelievably bad.
It leveled Antlers.
Just leveled it completely. Yeah. And my wife's home was blown down, and she escaped injury almost. She stepped on a nail crawling out of the debris. Several of my friends and relatives of my friends were killed. It was a devastating story.
That was in 1945.
That was 1945. Same day President Roosevelt died. The tornado didn't get quite as much publicity because it was the day that the president died, but it was a devastating, bad thing. And then when I was a freshman at OU, a tornado killed my father. We were living out on the county line 5 miles south of Antlers. It was a bad tornado, but it was mostly in the rural area, and I believe he was the only one killed, but it blew our house, little old shotgun house, out in the highway, and a heavy, what we called an ice box. It was not a refrigerator because we didn't have electricity, but it blew that thing on him and killed him and injured my mother. That was a devastating thing, too. We had to go home and make arrangements to bury my dad, and I had to borrow the money to do that, of course.
There's a name that comes up here, Fred LaRue.
Fred LaRue was a fraternity brother of mine from Jackson, Mississippi. He loaned us the automobile. I didn't even have a driver's license. And a friend from Hugo, Bob Farkson, agreed to drive me down there when we found out late at night that my dad had been killed. And another inebriated friend of mine came back from a party and went with us driving to Antlers, and it was a terrible rainstorm time of night. And he had to wade the creeks and everything to be sure we could get through the road, which sobered him up rather quickly, as you might imagine. But we got down there, and then they came on back, and I stayed to bury my father. But the same Fred LaRue later was involved in the Watergate scandal. He was assistant to the president, President Nixon at the time, served with John Mitchell to arrange for the payment of the Cubans and so forth, and lived in Jackson, had a very successful oil career after that. I never did get acquainted with him, except he did come to one Grand National quail hunt, and we got to hunt together, but that was long ago. He was a good man, despite getting caught up in a bad situation. What he did is the National Committee raised a lot of money to pay those people who broke in and to make their bail and all that. And he was the one that literally delivered the money to get that done. And he later pled guilty to a felony and served some time. I never did see him or talk to him about it after that happened, but it was a long time ago.
In your sophomore year, there are other names. You roomed with a gentleman by the name of Robert Short.
Robert Short was one of the cleverest, funniest people. I have a book that he wrote and sold 10 million copies in the first printing.
They just handed me the book, The Gospel According to Peanuts.
Robert Short and Bob Berry Sr., who just retired as the announcer of the OU football and basketball games, formed a comedy team patterned after young Dr. Kildare. They were kind of a sensation of the OU school as a comedy team. And then he went into the ministry and wrote this book called The Gospel According to Peanuts. He and Charles Schulz later became good friends. And as I say, that thing sold 10 million copies in the first printing, and then they've reprinted it again not so very long ago. Unfortunately, he's dead now, but he led a very interesting life.
Here he signed it to you, and then he finishes off by writing Boomer Sooner.
Yeah. You meet some strange and wacky people in college, don't you?
Yep. It was an exciting time to be at OU because Bud Wilkinson wins the national championship in 1950. And,
did.
And did you attend the game?
We attended the games and then went on down. Marion and I joined two of our friends and went to the Sugar Bowl game down in New Orleans. That was our first bowl game that I had ever attended. Wonderful experience. Had a lot of fun.
Did you ever get close to Bud Wilkinson, around him? Can you describe him, his personality at all?
We were never really close, except I became a good friend of his. And when I taught back at OU in the law school, this was later, went back to the law school to teach, I became even better acquainted with him. As a matter of fact, through his and Eddie Crowder's efforts, they admitted me as an honorary member of the Oak Club. I have an honorary membership in the Oak Club, and I'm very proud of that. He also asked me if I would head up his campaign when he ran for the Senate, and I declined because, although I supported him, I had strong Democratic inclinations and didn't want to do that. Unfortunately for him, he didn't win, but it wasn't because I wasn't his county representative.
His personality, what was he like to be around?
Well, of course, he's very brilliant, educated, and very, very pleasant man. But I got the impression that he would have a difficult time saying no, and I got that impression somewhat from visiting with him and with his friends who dealt with him regularly. Dr. Cross, who I became very close to, George Lynn Cross, who was president of the university, later confirmed that he had some difficulty really looking you in the eye and telling you things that you didn't want to hear. It just was very difficult for him. For all outward appearances, he was just an outstanding man.
Mm-hmm. Great athlete out of the University of Minnesota.
Minnesota, All-American. He had a wonderful family and, of course, later was divorced from his wife and remarried. One of his sons lives here now. Jay lives in Oklahoma City. And his other son, Pat, is a doctor. I believe he's gone back to Baltimore, if I'm not mistaken.
A guest in your fraternity was a guy by the name of George Nye.
George Nye was a guest and a good friend of several of my fraternity. Nick Harris was his closest friend. And so George visited us frequently, stayed at the house, on weekends. He was a teacher and a legislator at the time. So we became good friends when I was in undergraduate school.
But even though you were in the Navy, you transferred to the Marines. What happened there?
Well, I don't know. Willie Paul, who was one of my closest friends, and Lee Jenkins and I were in the NROTC and going on summer cruises, and we became a little bit disenchanted with shipboard life. It just was pretty confining, and it just didn't work out. So we started talking about transferring over and taking our commission in the Marine Corps, which you could do. But we waited until it was a little bit late to make the regular transfer. But after our third cruise, we decided we wanted to go in the Marine Corps. We talked with our executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jerry Russell, and he wanted us to transfer primarily because Willie Paul was kind of the commandant of the NROTC program. We debated and agreed and disagreed, and then we decided we weren't going to go unless we all went. Then one day I just sort of got tired of waiting, and I went over and signed up to transfer to the Marine Corps. Then I told Jenkins and Willie Paul, Bill Paul, we call him Willie, that I had done so, and they weren't sure they believed me, but they went on over and signed. They tried to get Colonel Russell to tell them, and he wouldn't tell them because he didn't want them to sign up just because I had. They signed, and when they came out of there, I had printed a big placard that said, "Jenkins and Paul are fools, West hasn't signed." And they were really, really pretty disturbed. They attacked me verbally and physically, and Colonel Russell had to come out and assure them that I had indeed signed. We've laughed about that often since then. As you know, Bill Paul later became president of the American Bar Association, an extremely successful lawyer, general counsel up at Bartlesville for Conoco, and has had a very distinguished career in the law. Jenkins later became vice president of Shearing Plow Corporation in Memphis. So they've had great, successful careers.
Well, you graduated, you were commissioned in the Marines, and you were married August 29th, 1952.
That's right, while I was in Quantico.
You head to Japan, and then you asked to be transferred to Korea.
Right.
And you got an early out, and then you went back to law school.
That's right, in 54.
You had a summer internship at that time. Tell us about that.
That was a summer intern program with Gulf Oil Corporation to see what it was like in the general counsel's office in Tulsa. I worked in Tulsa that summer. They provided me an office and treated me very, very well.
With your name on the door?
A name on the door, and I was very, very impressed with that. First office I'd ever had with my name on the door.
You graduate in May of 1956. You join a law firm in Ada.
I joined the law firm of former Justice Oral Busby, who had been on the Supreme Court and had ran for the U.S. Senate, and Virgil Stanfield and Austin Deaton, Jr., who was 2 or 3 years older than I was. And I replaced David Busby in the firm, who had gone with Mike Monroney to Washington, D.C., who was then the senator.
Then along about in here, you have 2 children.
Actually, we had 4 children. 2 of them were born prematurely and did not survive, 2 sons, twin sons. And then we had 2 daughters, Kimberly, who is now a magistrate judge in Muskogee, and Jennifer Lee. She's in the collection business in Tulsa. She works on debts and persuading people to pay their debts and so forth. And I have 1 granddaughter. Her daughter is nearly a 25-year-old young woman in California now named Mary Ellis Passy.
Back then you established a horse ranch.
Barshoe Ranch.
Barshoe Ranch. You met Ralph Evans.
Ralph Fireball Evans is probably the most notorious character that I have ever become involved with. He did everything. He coached, he taught, he had a candy store, he ran a lending agency, taught Spanish, and lived in Mexico for a while. And he and I were just close friends that got involved in a number of absolutely outrageous practical jokes. We kidnapped a U.S. Marshal on one occasion, Bill Broderick, and took him to Raton, New Mexico. We had a horse out there that we were going to bring back. So we drove by his house, Bill Broderick. He was having a drink with his wife on the patio, and we invited him to go with us and let him call home when we got to Sayre. And he attempted to explain to Emma Joyce that he'd been kidnapped, which she did not believe at all. But at any rate, we took him all the way to Raton, spent 2 days, and brought him back, but he never did convince Emma Joyce that we had actually kidnapped, which we had.
You took on a criminal defense case, and you defended a man by the name of Lonnie Pointer.
Lonnie Pointer was a common crook. He and two other guys robbed a grocery store in Ada. They attempted to blow open the safe, which they did, but they burned the building down in getting that done. So I represented Painter, and he agreed to testify against the other defendants in exchange for not being imprisoned himself. Plea bargaining, of course. First, they brought him back from Tulsa. They arrested all three of them in Tulsa. They brought him back, and their forensic evidence showed that when he got back to Ada, he had shoes that had mud that the expert testified came from the alley behind that building that had burned. This was during preliminary hearing. I had to try to establish that he'd gotten the mud on his feet from some other source. So our friend, Bill Broderick, the marshal who we had kidnapped, we had seen him on that day. The assistant district attorney was Jim Gasway, and he and I were driving to Oklahoma City, and we drove by Bill Broderick having a snowball fight out on the side of the road with the highway department employees just that morning. Then later, they were at the preliminary hearing, they presented this evidence that Painter had mud on his shoes from Ada, from Pontotoc County, and that Bill Broderick had transported him back to Ada on that same day that we saw him out there. I cross-examined the sheriff, who was a good friend of mine, at length about whether he had been anywhere that he could have gotten some mud on his shoes, and then later into his car where Painter could have gotten in. Of course, he denied it vigorously, and I'm sure in good faith. But after I got him to deny it a number of times, I asked him if he remembered having a snowball fight out on the side of the road with the people. I said, if your memory has failed you, and I'm sure it has, I'll put the assistant district attorney, Mr. Jim Gasway, on the stand and let him help refresh your memory, because he was with me when we drove by. And, of course, they very quickly offered us a plea bargain deal so that we pled guilty and didn't have to go to prison. Bill was a little embarrassed about it, but he forgave me for it. Even guys that are honest and truthful, I found out in law enforcement, they'll sometimes forget pretty significant things when they're on the stand. And
selective forgetfulness.
Selective memory.
Yeah.
Exactly.
When you defended the criminal, did you ever think you wanted to be a defense attorney?
Well, I had had some experience in the Marine Corps as a defense counsel and court marshals. I did give some pretty serious thoughts about being, and of course in Ada, when you're practicing law with a small firm, you take almost any kind of business you can get. I mean, anything. I was comfortable. I was really a little more comfortable on the defense side than I would have been on the prosecution side.
Why?
Well, I don't know, and I'm afraid that has followed me throughout my judicial career, is that I've been very sensitive, for some reason, to the fact that the defendant, who is usually overwhelmed by the state's resources and the federal government's resources in prosecuting these cases, they're often overwhelmed and outmatched, and you have to be especially vigilant to be sure that their rights have not been violated. And, of course, it hadn't got any better. There's the Brady rule that says that the government's supposed to provide them with any information that's hopeful or helpful to them as far as a defense, and that's, in my opinion, frequently violated. And so I've been a little bit more sensitive. Let me put it this way. I hope it's not being unfair. I've probably been a little more sensitive to the defense rights and defense's opportunities than have some of my colleagues. That was true on the state court and on the federal bench.
But did you want to be a judge all your, at least, college and law life? Where did this idea of a judge planted in you?
As a junior in law school, I had already had 1 year law school before I went to the Marine Corps. Then I served on a court-martial or two when I was in the Marine Corps. When I came back to law school my junior year, I formed a very firm impression that if I ever get an opportunity to be a federal judge, induced a lot by the fact that there's lifetime security to it, so an appointment for life. If you could keep your nose clean, you can't be removed, or your salary can't be diminished by making unpopular decisions. You can be independent, in other words. And I determined at that time that that's what I would like to be, never thinking that there'd likely be an opportunity for me to ever do that. But that was when I was a junior in law school.
Was it the security of the job, or was it the actual work of being a judge that attracted you?
It's a little bit of both, but mostly it's the work. I really enjoy resolving disputes or helping people resolve disputes in whatever role I can be. And I think that's borne out by the fact that I do an enormous number of settlement conferences for the other judges since I've taken senior status. That's to help settle. I don't have any authority in the case other than to get the parties together and visit with them and reason with them, give them the benefit of my experience to help them resolve disputes. And that's the part of this job that has always appealed to me. And, of course, having grown up poor, I've been somewhat security conscious, and this provides certainly not a way to make the most money, but it provides reasonably good security. All that added up to my wanting to do this very much.
We should mention that when you were a special lecturer at OU, one of your students was a gentleman by the name of Andy Coates.
Still is a friend of mine, despite exchanging insults and accolades down through the years.
Tell us about him a minute.
Well, Andy is, as everybody knows, an outstanding person. I first met him when I was judging moot court competition down there at OU. He immediately stands out. He was selected as the outstanding senior in his graduating class at OU, and I recommended him strongly to the Crow-Dunlevy firm, to Bill Paul, who was my best friend in law school. They hired him, and, of course, he had a successful career there. Ran for office unsuccessfully for the U.S. Senate, but he became district attorney and then mayor, successful mayor, and then has for the last 14 years been the dean of the OU Law School, and they named the building after him down there, justifiably so.
You applied for a grant from the Ford Foundation, and you went to Harvard.
Went to Harvard in 1962. I got a Ford Foundation fellowship in law teaching to the Harvard Law School and spent a year there and completed the paper and lectureship for an LLM.
You chose personal injury litigation as a topic of your graduate program.
That's what I was really very much interested in. I taught damages down at OU, and then I'd practiced some personal injury work at Ada, so that was the main subject. But I took some courses in estate planning and in creditors' rights and so forth as well. I was able to do that.
You sat in on lectures by Henry Kissinger.
Well, I did. We could audit lectures. I didn't know anything about Henry Kissinger when I went up there, but I kept hearing this name, that he was an outstanding guy. We went over and audited a couple of his classes on national security and so forth.
Were you impressed by him?
I was not terribly impressed because I had some difficulties with his language, but, of course, he almost immediately became a national figure in the government. He was in Washington all of the years that I was with the Civil Aeronautics Board.
Your Harvard degree was very helpful to you as you came back here?
I think so. I don't know how much it helps you. It helped to do a lot for my confidence, you know. There's a quote, if you have a degree from Harvard Law School, there is a presumption that at least you're not a damn fool. But Andy Coates goes around telling everybody, he said, down in Antlers, Oklahoma, where Lee grew up, it doesn't even change the burden of proof. He did that recently. I went with him to a speech out here 3 days ago, and he's still using that line.
Meanwhile, the firm of Deaton, Gasaway, and West is flourishing.
Doing well.
You represented,
by small-town standards.
And you represented an old cowboy by the name of Don Wilkins.
Don Wilkins was from Bucky, Louisiana. He was a cowboy and a horse trader and judged a lot of quarter horse shows. But he was injured in Oklahoma in an automobile accident so that his ankle was pretty badly broken. We represented him. We called another cowboy Don Wilcoxon, who used to be an old trick and fancy rider. He testified at the trial that Don was an outstanding horse trainer and that because of these injuries, he had lost his ability to spur or train horses, and that it had cost him enormous income and all that sort of thing. I was very doubtful about using Don, but it turned out he was a very persuasive witness. The jury gave us $35,000 damages for a broken ankle, which was not only the largest in Pontotoc County, but that was a huge amount of money that long ago. So the word got out that we could do a personal injury case, and we were doing fairly well when this vacancy for the court came up.
That would be the Ada District Judge John McKeel.
John Boyce McKeel died of cancer.
That was in 1965. So tell us why that was significant.
John Boyce McKeel had been a long time elected district judge there and was a good judge. He called me when I was at Harvard, as a matter of fact, and we had talked about the fact that I'd like to be on the bench and that I certainly never did intend to run against him. But he called me to tell me that if you want to try to get this job, you better get on back down here because I've been diagnosed with cancer and prognosis is not good, so you better come on back, which I did, instead of taking some teaching engagements that I could have gotten, and rejoined Austin and Jim practicing law down there. When he died, Henry Bellman was the governor, although I did not know Governor Bellman at all, and he was in the Republican Party. I applied along with Calvert Cannon, who was a Democrat, and Bob Macy, who was a Democrat, but Bob, when he heard about John Boyce becoming ill, he transferred to the Republican Party, thinking, of course, that that might assist him with a Republican governor. After we went through interviews and everything, I was still pretty pessimistic that there would be a Democrat appointed down there because some of the senator's staff had told me very candidly that they were encouraging him to appoint nothing but Republicans, you know. But at any rate, he, for whatever reason, selected me and appointed me across party lines to be the district judge in the 22nd Judicial District.
Governor Bellman did that.
Governor Bellman did that.
And at that time showed that he was his own judge and jury and made his own decisions and probably rarely listened to a whole lot of people. The pressure.
It was amazing to me because when I went up to interview, one of the staff members told me, Mason was his name, he used to teach out here at Central State University. He said, Lee, you have a lot of good friends and supporters, but I'm not one of them. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, because we're trying to urge the governor to appoint Republicans. Sure enough, that conversation never came up in Henry Bellman's office. So he made the judgment independent of at least some members of his staff to go ahead and cross party lines. It was only later that he and I became friends. After he had appointed me, I didn't think he was going to do it, to tell you the truth.
So then, giving him credit and you credit, he decided you were the most qualified. If you'd been a Republican, he would have named you, but he named you, and you happened to be a Democrat.
Despite being a Democrat, as he's frequently and publicly said, he deserves the credit.
I believe he said that you were the least offensive Democrat from Little Dixie.
He said that many times, as a matter of fact.
So for the next 8 years, you enjoyed your work.
Very much. It was an enjoyable, thoroughly enjoyable position.
Tell us about Uncle Elmer.
Uncle Elmer West was not an uncle of mine, but they quickly nicknamed him Uncle Elmer because he was not at all fond of me. I don't know, some of my rulings or something had aggravated him because he'd walk up and down the streets. He told Francis Mayhew, who was a lawyer friend of mine, he said, you know, they ought to give that Lee West a sanitary hearing and appoint him a guardian. I asked Francis, I said, Francis, did you defend me? And he said, well, sort of. I told him, I said, he might pass a sanitary hearing, but there ain't no way in the world he'll ever pass a sanitary hearing. Elmer was a character, and I'll tell one more anecdote about Elmer. He had a lot of enemies around town. One of them was Melvin Chilcote, kind of a smallish guy. And he walked up behind Melvin one day at Melvin's place of business, and he hit Melvin with a roundhouse hook in his right ear. Well, when Melvin turned around, he just happened to have a tire tool in his hand, and he cracked old Elmer right between the horns with that and knocked him out. No charges were brought. One other occasion, Eskel Myers, who was no admirer of Elmer's, they got into a confrontation, and Eskel pulled a pistol. It went off. It didn't hit Elmer, but Elmer fainted from fear. He was later complaining to Gordon Melson, who was the district attorney at the time. He said, "Why didn't you file charges against him?" And he said, "Elmer, I had more people complaining and want me to file against Eskel for missing you." Elmer was a character. That's the best you can say for him.
1967, you presided over a very publicized criminal case, State of Oklahoma versus Emmett Ray McCarthy.
One of the most amazing characters I ever encountered. He was 6'9" or 10. He was a con man, and he had been all of his life, but very personable and likable. He was being transported for medical attention from one facility to another, and he managed to take the pistol away from his guard, confiscated the trooper's car, left him standing beside the road, and headed down toward Stratford. Of course, he was getting communications all the time, and he knew he had to get rid of that trooper's car, so he stopped in Stratford, which is a small town where Molly Shy was born, incidentally, to steal a car from the only law enforcement officer in Stratford, Oklahoma. And he not only stole his car, but he took him and his wife and 2 girls in custody, and they went to Ardmore. They were headed for Texas, of course. He got to Ardmore, and he wanted to change that vehicle. Word quickly gotten out, so they stopped at a lady's house with a Cadillac in the driveway. She was an elderly lady and very reluctant to cooperate in any way. The law enforcement guy had to help persuade her to turn over that Cadillac. As a matter of fact, she wouldn't do it until they all unloaded a bunch of flowers and so forth that were in her car, and then turned the keys onto him. And fortunately, they went on down, and he was captured without serious incident. I appointed 2 great friends and lawyers, Vernon Roberts and Johnson, to represent him. On the day of trial, I found out that he had escaped the night before. He escaped in bad weather with a shirt on. He hid out in the trees for a couple of 3 days, then approached the house. They saw him and ran off and left him there. He was starving, so he went in to get something to eat. While he was there, the local highway patrolman named John Wayne Smith, believe it or not, showed up along with Marvin Barnes, who is a celebrated horseman from down there, and he had a .410 shotgun. Emmett Ray McCarthy hid behind a sofa while they were attempting to assault the house, so to speak. The shotgun went off into the ground. Emmett Ray came out and he said, "Hey, I'm giving up before somebody out there gets hurt." And he did, and then he escaped. Before the next trial, he escaped again by taking a toothpick and convincing the jailer that he had a knife. Got out and did a crazy thing. He spent all night talking a fella into taking him to Texas, let the guy load him up in the back of his car, locked the hood down. They had a bunch of roadblocks set up, and they drove to the first one and said he's in the back there. But he finally put him to trial. He was convicted and given a 10-year sentence. One of Vernon's comments in closing argument was, "Emmett Ray," said, "I hate to say this about you because you're a friend of mine, but you're kind of a nut." Said, "You had about as much chance escaping as an elephant in a snowstorm with a real bad nosebleed." But in the meantime, Vernon had served as a conduit of all sorts of community generosity and concern. He became a very beloved character locally.
Kind of a celebrity, wasn't he?
That's exactly.
There are others, criminals, who have a charismatic nature to them, and they're able to talk people in and out, and that must have been him.
He was an expert at it.
You presided over another slightly unusual murder trial in Pontotoc County, the State of Oklahoma versus Dub Jones.
Dub Jones.
He was charged with shooting a man to death the entrance of his beer joint west of Ada.
That's right.
What was that about?
Dub was an operator of a beer joint, and the young man that he shot and killed was part Indian, I presume Chickasaw, but I don't recall. Dub was charged with first-degree murder by Gordon Melson, who later was district judge, but at that time he was the district attorney. Dub was defended by Bob Macy, later the district attorney here in Oklahoma County for a long period of time. Well, we had that trial go on for several days, and we got it submitted to the jury late one afternoon. While they were out deliberating, I went to dinner with Gordon Melson, the district attorney, Bob Macy, the defense counsel, and Dub Jones, the defendant. We all went to a local restaurant there. We were all there. The case wasn't discussed and all. But I can't imagine how many headlines would be produced. But we didn't think anything was wrong with it. And, in fact, there wasn't anything wrong with it. That's another story Andy Coates likes to bring up.
And Jones was found to be innocent.
He was found to be innocent. Macy did an excellent job of defending him. Of course, Gordon was a good district attorney. But the verdict was that he was acting in self-defense.
When you were on the state bench, and then obviously became on the federal bench, but you can comment here on how difficult it is to be a judge in an area where you know all the attorneys, to the point that maybe it was even more difficult being in state than federal.
It is, particularly if you own a court in a smaller city, such as Ada, a town. All of the lawyers that are practicing before you are usually close friends, social friends, associates of some sort. They'll question your rulings, but they don't really complain about that too much. If you have to get into the area of telling them where their conduct is professional or correct or not, they don't handle that too well, and it's a difficult situation. I cite the example that I had with my former partner, Austin Deaton, who was, until he died, a close friend. I appointed him to represent a defendant in a criminal case. At the first hearing of some kind, he sent over an associate to appear at the proceeding. We went through that, but I told his associates, I said, now you tell Austin that he's appointed as counsel to defend this guy, and he has to be here for any subsequent hearing. It absolutely infuriated Austin because he thought I was telling him how to run his law office, and I'd been a former member of that. For some reason, he perceived that as an attempt by me to tell him how to run that law firm after I had left. Boy, he became very upset and remained upset for some time, but we later on renewed our close friendship and relationship, and as a matter of fact, I spoke at his funeral services.
So it was uncomfortable telling these guys that you knew. Did you just have to draw down from your...
Oh, you do. You hunted with them, and you've practiced with them, and you've shared all of the, quote, secret thoughts and beliefs. Then to have to stand up there and say, now this is just not the way you're supposed to behave. And, of course, Barney Ward, who was a blind attorney and a great and good friend of mine, he was just terrible at getting to hearings on time. I had to attempt to sanction him for doing that. He became very upset with me. When I went to the Civil Aeronautics Board, he told Gordon Melson, he said, when they called me about Lee, I told him he'd be a great member of the Civil Aeronautics Board because I was afraid he wouldn't get that appointment, would stay down here. But he later forgave me, too. We had a good relationship.
You hunted, and you hunted snakes.
Frank Vincent was a deputy sheriff who owned some land. There's an outcrop down south, down around Fitztown, a limestone outcrop that is just a wonderful place for snakes. There's perhaps thousands of dens of snakes in that particular area. We used to go down in the spring while they were still somewhat drowsy and out sunning, and we'd capture these snakes with herp sticks. Frank taught me how to defang them and to tape up their mouth so they couldn't bite anybody. I used them to train bird dogs, to what we call snake-proof bird dogs. Let them go up and smell that snake who couldn't bite them. Then I'd bump them with an electric collar, and boy, pretty soon when they smelled a snake, they'd learn to avoid it. Well, we weren't satisfied with just training dogs, though. Norman McNabb was an All-American football player at the University of Oklahoma and captain of the national championship team in '50, and he and I were close hunting buddies at that time. He came down to the Kiwanis Club to make a speech on wildlife. He was with the wildlife department. They asked me to introduce him because they knew we were friends, and I did. And I had a snake, a rattlesnake, in a paper bag with the top snapped together. And after his speech, I said, we always have a habit of presenting our guest speakers with something, and I have something that I think is in keeping with the wildlife theme. And I poured that snake out on the table right in front of him. Of course, when I poured it out, it was agitated. It was really singing and hitting at glasses. Couldn't open his mouth, but he didn't know it. We were all at a table next to the wall, and he just sort of fell back, tried to. But Fireball Evans, who was the only other person in the room that knew what was about to happen, he ran up with a blank starter pistol and started shooting, aiming at the snake. Of course, nothing but noise came out. But Norman, every time he shot, he had him lined up directly. He thought he was being shot as well. I got considerable criticism for pulling that stunt. Matter of fact, Bill Lee was the president, and he said, you dumb so-and-so, said, what would we have done if that fella had a heart attack and died? And I said, well, we'd have had to bury him. That's the only decent thing to do. But they broke about $65 worth of cheap dishes, and when the crowd just sort of imploded or exploded, they made me pay for all of those dishes. They were cheap dishes, but they made me pay for them, and they never, after, invited me to introduce anyone at the Kiwanis Club.
But everybody remembered that one and probably told it to others, and more people ended up saying I was there when it happened than actually were there.
Absolutely. It's one of my finer moments that everybody's embarrassed about. Fortunately, that was never reported in a form of a judicial complaint, and it was never raised in either one of my two presidential appointment confirmation hearings. Now, I don't think there's any way in the world you could explain it without suffering from it substantially, but it never was brought up.
You presided over a car bombing case in Tulsa. Judge
Fred Nelson.
Tell us about that.
Fred Nelson was a district judge, and he, as a matter of fact, was presiding over these cases involving McDonald and Pugh, some of them. They had several, you know.
And Cleo Epps.
Cleo Epps murder case. At any rate, he was running for re-election as a judge. One of the defense counsel for McDonald and Pugh was also an announced candidate. And on the morning of the election, Fred Nelson got into his car to go vote, as a matter of fact, and it exploded. They had planted a bomb in there. He was almost killed, but very seriously injured. Despite that, he was reelected enormously. All of the local judges disqualified because of their close association with him. And I was assigned to try that case, the bombing case, and the Cleo Epps murder case, and Arliss Delbert Self murder case, and 3 or 4 others. So I went up to Tulsa to try all of those and tried several of them before I was appointed to the Civil Aeronautics Board.
District Attorney Buddy Fallis.
Buddy Fallis was the prosecuting attorney. He's still alive in Tulsa. I saw him a couple of 3 years ago. He seems to be doing well.
Yeah, and I interviewed him for our website. You were asked to talk to a young lady who was named Molly Shy.
Molly Shy was the daughter of a doctor in Stratford, Oklahoma, born there. She was a school teacher. I had a friend in Ada that I had appointed to be the master of the only grand jury I called while I was in Ada on the bench. And he asked me to speak with her, said she was contemplating attending law school, but she was a little concerned about a woman's place in the law at that time and whether she could do it successfully, and wanted to know if I'd be willing to talk with her. I'd taught at OU and was on the state bench down there. I told him, of course, I'd be happy to. I didn't know her. But she came and we visited, and it became very apparent very quickly that she wasn't going to encounter any problems becoming a good student and a good lawyer or doing anything that she wanted to. So I encouraged her strongly. Fortunately, I told her she would have no difficulty and she should do it by all means. Well, she did. She became an outstanding law student. And then she came to Ada and served on the state court bench as a special judge shortly after I left for Washington, D.C. But fortunately for me, she then later married David Bourne, who was the governor of the state of Oklahoma, later U.S. Senator. So my appointment to the federal bench came up. He has openly confessed that of the candidates, every night when he came home, the last words he'd hear were Lee West, Lee West, Lee West. So I don't think that played a small part in my fortunate ability to get appointed to this position.
But you had, should I say, contact with David Bourne because when he ran for State House from Seminole County, his opponent was Bill Wantland, and that was a close election.
That was a close election, and I was assigned up there to preside over the recount. That was for David's first attempt at public office. He and Bill Wantland ran. During the recount, fortunately for me, it turned out the same way. As a matter of fact, I think David picked up a few votes so that he won even more than he had. And I don't have any doubt but that he and Molly would have gone on to great success. But I'm not sure I would have ever been appointed a federal judge if it had not been for those two things. If he'd lost that election, I don't think there's any possibility that I ever would have.
Why do you think you were a Democrat?
Well, I don't know. When I was a very young guy, this whole state was strongly Democrat, great FDR, New Deal supporters. And I can't help but remember with gratitude that my mother was able to get a job for the WPA, earning $21 a month as a bookbinder. She did that while I was in grade school and, well, until my father was killed. I remembered that, and I always believed, and I still believe, that the government is not the enemy. I mean, I just really do believe that government programs, although some of them can get out of whack and out of hand, the government is here to help us rather than to hurt us. And although it's been strange sometimes, I still believe that. I believe, because of that experience and what has happened since then, that the Democrat Party still more likely represents the interest of the larger part of the people in this country than do the Republicans. I have had great support from Republicans. All of my colleagues, almost all, are Republicans. They're all very close, dear friends of mine, and I have had many, many good, close Republican friends, but I still remain a registered Democrat. I try to tell them that I don't want my being a Democrat to ever influence a decision that I make, and they all assure me that I've failed in that frequently, as a matter of fact.
But this Republican, Henry Bellman, while he named you to the state bench, he gives you another call about a possible vacancy on the Civil Aeronautics Board. The CAB was created in 1938 to regulate and promote the airline industry. One of the architects of that was Oklahoma Senator Mike Maroney. You must have done a good job as a Democrat, because here comes Republican Bellman saying, you know what, we'd really like to have you here in Washington.
Henry Bellman was an astonishing man, in my opinion. I have as much respect for him, not only because he's been nice to me, but because he's been such a great person to the state of Oklahoma and for the state of Oklahoma. He was always pretty interested in trying to get Oklahomans involved in the federal government if the opportunity arose. He called me and he told me just that. I said, well, I thought I'd broke you of appointing Democrats to anything. And he said, well, unfortunately, this is a Democratic position on the Civil Aeronautics Board, and I'm always trying to get Oklahomans involved. And would you and Mary Ann consider it? So I said, well, give me a few days to think about it. And sure enough, the idea appealed to Mary Ann, quite frankly, more than it did to me. But I called him and told him. He said, well, it's not likely to happen. I just didn't want to advance your name until and unless you had agreed to it. He did. Sometime later, I got a call from Mr. Carl Albert, who was the Speaker of the House at the time. He said, Judge, I just wanted you to know that I've been advised that your name has been submitted to the White House to be a member of the Civil Aeronautics Board, and I have called and enthusiastically endorsed and support you for that. Well, I was apologetic to him. I said, Mr. Speaker, I apologize because I didn't even think it was going to happen anyhow, and I didn't even have the good judgment to call you. He'd been my congressman almost all my life. He said, don't worry about that. He said, there isn't anything I like doing more than helping someone who needs help. And so I'm extremely grateful to him for his support, and it was substantial as Speaker of the House. But anyhow, that came about, much to my surprise. We had some ups and downs because of American Airlines and typical Washington suspicion of some obscure small-town judge getting appointed to a national regulatory agency. But we got through that without too much trouble.
Senator Dewey Bartlett at the time was a big defender of you.
He was a great defender and appeared at my hearing and supported me.
And was a Republican that here is defending you.
He was indeed.
Yeah, American Airlines had contributed to the Nixon campaign, and they thought maybe because American Airlines had a plant in Tulsa that there was some partiality going on here. But you got through all that. You had all these letters of support. What was your job then? Can you describe what you were doing then, the day-to-day matters of the CAB?
We regulated the airlines from an economic standpoint. We had formerly had safety, the CAB had under the bill, but that had been moved over to the Department of Transportation. So all we had to do is to regulate routes and rates. In other words, we negotiated agreements with foreign countries, and we authorized the flights from one city to another here in the United States and the frequency of that. It was just a constant, ongoing affair of having hearings, approving rates, approving routes, and negotiating agreements with foreign countries for their right to fly into our country and our right to fly into theirs at certain intervals.
You also promoted getting rid of smoking on airplanes.
I did. I hardly ever smoked, but I always felt that secondary smoke was as bad as, or almost as bad as direct smoking. So I encouraged all my colleagues. I said, I'll join with you on any restrictive vote on allowing smoking on airlines because I think it should be eliminated altogether. Whatever the most restrictive program you all will agree to, I'll join with you on that. We've made some restrictions on it, but it didn't, of course, until later pass.
But it started with you.
That's exactly right.
Right. And so we have you to thank for that.
Well, I hope so. I'll take all the credit I can get.
And you should. You became close friends with a Democrat from New York, which is an interesting tie here. Tell us who he is.
His name was Joe Manetti, and he was an Italian from the Bronx. He and I formed a close personal relationship. I used to joke it was because of the similarity of our backgrounds. Brooklyn and Antlers are very much alike, but he and I were kind of kindred spirits. He was a big influence on me. He was the first one that guided me the strongest in saying, now, airlines are going to try to do you favors. They're going to do everything they can for you, and don't let them. He said, now, you think about anything they offer you, and if you don't want it on the Washington Post front page, if it wouldn't read good, just don't do it. Sure enough, that turned out to be good advice because Bob Tim, our first chairman there, he accepted a golf trip and got, in effect, kicked off the board for that. A lot of other people got into bad situations. So he gave me good advice on that. He was an interesting man. He was a very bright man. His wife, interestingly enough, was the widow of Joseph McCarthy, the notorious Joseph McCarthy. And she and my wife and two children became very close friends. She was a wonderful lady, and they spent a good deal of time. And my daughter, Kim, wrote a thesis of some kind about Joe and about her.
Did you talk to her about her former husband, Joseph McCarthy? Did you get a feel?
I did, and as you might expect, she's very loyal to him. She would not say anything very critical of him at all, although I know she was concerned about it. But she was most critical of Roy Coyne, his lawyer, and one other guy as having influenced him and directed him in the wrong direction. But she never could bring herself to personally criticize her dead husband, and I respected that. She was his widow. They were married when he died, and then she later married Joe Minetti. He was as liberal or more than I am, and I know he personally didn't think very well of McCarthy, but he, like me, I think he sort of respected the fact that she wasn't going to be critical of her first husband, because she then might be pretty critical of her second husband.
When you were in the CAB, you supported lower airfares to benefit the public and to increase competition, but that wasn't necessarily the opinion of everybody in the CAB.
Oh, no. On every one of these rates and routes deal, the issue would come up, and it wasn't often a 5-0 decision. It was divided and split. And then we got further into the deal. The issue of deregulation came up while I was there. The staff and the board sort of got at odds over how much the airline should be released from any regulation, deregulated totally, and how fast. There was all sorts of gradations of that in on the board, and I favored greater competition. That had been my all along, greater competition, but I was just concerned about throwing it open to market because I was concerned about the big airlines just completely overwhelming the smaller ones. It would result in reduced fares for a short period of time and then sharply escalating fares thereafter. So I was a little bit at odds and made some speeches and was called on to make some speeches before the Kennedy Committee and all that other thing about what the impact of deregulation would be. Kennedy, of course, Edward Kennedy, was in favor of deregulation, and I worked with Stephen Breyer, who's now on the Supreme Court. We talked about it and worked together. He was on Kennedy's staff. So we all had different ideas about how fast and how completely the airline industry should be deregulated. Andy Coates has frequently said he doesn't know what happened, but after I served, very shortly after, they abolished the Civil Aeronautics Board, and the airline industry's been messed up ever since.
Did you have interaction with Ted Kennedy about
I
the
did.
position?
Well, not social, but I appeared before his subcommittee pretty frequently.
How did you find him?
I found him delightful, personally, had the greatest staff in the world. But if he got beyond the work that the staff had done for him, in my opinion, he was less than totally impressive.
Mm-hmm. However, your premise that we ought to have lower airfares and all, the Republicans favored the opposite.
Well, ordinarily they did, but Gerald Ford, when he was in the presidency, Joe Minetti and I formed a kind of a block in favor of lower fares and so forth. And Nixon, of course, supported higher fares. But when Ford came on, he kind of joined Joe Minetti and I. So for a short while there, we became the majority of the CAB, the two of us and the president.
Were you with the president in conversations about this?
I was with the president on a number of occasions. We appeared over at the White House to discuss these aviation matters. And I remember the first time I ever saw Tom Brokaw in person was he was covering one of those sessions that we were having over at the White House. The few occasions I was around President Ford, I enjoyed him thoroughly, but I never did develop any kind of a close relationship.
But his grasp of the issues and what you were talking
very
about
much,
was
I was very much like that.
And you were named acting chairman of the CAB by President Jimmy Carter.
That's right. When President Carter came in, the chairman of the CAB had resigned, and he intended and did appoint Fred Kahn, who was an economics professor at Cornell University, and then later in New York State, headed up some regulatory commission. He was the heir apparent, and President Carter appointed me as the acting chairman until Mr. Kahn was investigated and confirmed and sworn in. So I served maybe over a year.
Any thoughts about the airline industry today?
Well, I really am inept. There has been a number of changes that have taken place. The only thing I can say is that I travel less and less by air, almost only when I can't get anywhere else, because it has become so terribly uncomfortable and difficult. In the first place, I don't fit seats as well as I did, and you spend so much more time on the tarp waiting around. It was always a little frustrating for me, but it really is now. I just don't do it if I can keep from it.
You probably prophesied the picture of the airline industry today, because
somewhat
the large airlines have taken over the small ones and our airfares have gone up. So what you were talking about,
I think, has taken place, and the people can argue with that and probably should, but I like to say I told you so.
Your days in Washington, were they fun socially? Did you and your wife take in many social events?
My wife loved it. She's a good bit more of a social animal than I am, and she just loved it. She enjoyed every bit of it. Quite frankly, I didn't enjoy it nearly as much, although I did continue to do a good bit of field trialing activities while I was in Washington, D.C., and had access to the South area that I had frequented before, which was good. But we were fairly active socially, but, boy, that's a fast pace.
There's probably a party every night if somebody wanted to go.
Every single night. We were on a list. Every single night there was a cocktail party and a deal to attend. Quite frankly, you just can't do all of them, so you get more and more selective about them as you go along.
I can't see Henry Bellman doing many of those either.
He didn't do a lot. As a matter of fact, when I got ready to leave the Civil Aeronautics Board, I went over and had lunch with him in the Senate dining room, and I told him, I said, Senator, I'm thinking about resigning a little early. My term would end in January, and I could probably have gotten reappointed, but I said, I'm thinking about resigning a little early simply to get my daughter, who's in high school, back during the summer so that we won't have to switch schools in mid-year. I said, I just wanted to ask you if that would meet with your approval, since you're largely, or you're at least held responsible for my job. He said, I'm a little amazed you've stayed as long as you have. You know, he was never really fond of Washington, D.C. either at all, less so probably than I was.
Then you come back to Oklahoma, and you live in a home near Claremore because you joined the law firm of Hall Estill in 1978. What kind of work did you do there?
Well, I worked for the Williams Company. Joe Williams was the chief executive officer of the Hall Estill law firm, and they were involved in a lot of antitrust litigation and all that sort of thing. Fred Nelson, who had recovered, was one of the senior partners in that firm. They were the ones that were primarily responsible for getting me. I wanted to come back to Oklahoma, but I didn't know what I was going to do, and I made it clear to them that I hoped to get a federal judicial appointment, and that would be one of my aims. So primarily what I did was represent the Williams companies. I did do a little work for Eastern Airlines, but not very much. Eastern Airlines is a client, but I didn't represent hardly any of them. None of the other people that we'd previously regulated. I did that for 19 months, during which time this vacancy occurred, and they had commissions to appoint several positions. There are 4 on the federal trial bench and 1 on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals position.
That was kind of almost a perfect storm there for you, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
By the way, some of the lawyers that you worked with at Hall Estill, do you recall some of those names?
Oh, yeah. Tom Golden, Frank Hagedorn, Claire Egan, who is the federal judge over in Tulsa now. She was with the firm. Tom Gable.
So Senator Bourne was a senior Democrat senator from Oklahoma, even though he'd been newly elected.
Yes.
He was a senior Democrat, and this would be under President Jimmy Carter. Then that's when you come along with others like Thomas Brett.
Tom Brett, Tulsa.
James Ellison.
Tulsa.
And District Judge Frank Say of Seminole.
Seminole.
All those names, including Stephanie Seymour for the 10th Circuit Court. That Senator Bourne, under President Carter, is able to make all those appointments. That was a pretty big deal.
That was a huge deal. He says that he recognized that as perhaps the most significant thing, his appointments to the federal bench, and particularly that many. At that time, the White House controlled the circuit appointments a good bit more than they did the district court position. But one of the difficulties that we encountered as a group is that we were all four white-eyed guys, and Stephanie was a woman. Stephanie was appropriately appointed to the 10th Circuit, but there was some concern in the White House that they needed more diversity. And so we had that struggle. Senator Boren was, I don't want to put the onus on him, but he was extremely influential in that, getting the four of us appointed as opposed to someone else.
And your district was covering all of western Oklahoma.
Western Oklahoma.
What are some of the differences between state and federal court?
Well, there are a number. The most significant is that the federal appointment is a lifetime appointment during good behavior, and that's extremely important because having served both, I can tell you, it's not a healthy thing to be looking over your shoulder at every single decision as to how popular or unpopular it will be at the moment. Yeah, I mean, there's just a good deal more security when you could look at it and say, well, this may not be the right decision. I think it is, but the fact that a lot of people are terribly upset with it at the present time or somewhat upset with it is not going to get me kicked out of office. And believe me, anybody will tell you that is a significant comforting feeling as a judge. And I think it's a very important thing, that the independence of the judiciary. The other is there's more security financially, not only just for the lifetime appointment, but the pay and the benefits. But the biggest difference is the staffing that you have as a federal judge. Although it's not large, I have two outstanding law clerks, an outstanding secretary, and a court reporter and a courtroom deputy. As a state court judge, and even when I was on the Supreme Court by special appointment, you don't have any of that. You're out there doing all the research yourself, drafting all the opinions. I've always tried to hire law clerks, and have, that were a hell of a lot smarter than I am and with more ability than I have. I've been very successful at that, and they can be an enormous assistance to you.
You had a full load, and you had a backup of trial cases, but you devised a plan to settle these cases before coming to trial, settlement conferences.
Tom Brett and I got to give him a good bit of credit. We were the first ones that implemented it over here, but when I came on board, we were trying 16% of the cases that were filed, civil cases I'm talking about. That was a good bit higher than the national average, which was 9%. Judge Luther Eubanks was our chief judge then, and after looking at this, I was trying 2 cases a day and all that sort of thing, trying to reduce that backlog, working enormously hard, killing my staff and everything. But I went to him and I said, we're not settling as many of these cases as they do on the national level. Something's wrong with our system. That prompted him to say, yeah, figure out why and let's change. Tom and I talked, and we got the idea from a fellow up in Ohio by the name of Tom Lambros, who we knew at a judicial conference, of having kind of a briefed advisory opinion affecting jurors that would allow jurors to indicate to the parties the merits of their case without going through a long 8 or 10 week trial. It's called a summary jury trial. We set it up down here. What it amounted to is a trial, except you don't present detailed evidence. You allow the attorneys to summarize what their evidence is. As an officer of the court, they have to assure the court that the evidence is available for whatever they say. But we allow them to summarize their case, then make arguments, and we instruct the jury just as we would in a regular case. All of that can be done in 1 or maybe 2 days. And then when the jury returns a verdict, it's merely advisory. It is not binding on the parties, but it gives them some idea. It worked amazingly well. We went from settling 84% of our cases to settling 94% almost in a year or 2. Then it finally got up where it is now, 98%. Most of the cases are compromised and settled. Now, that's because of some help and encouragement we give. but it's also because it's gotten so terribly expensive to litigate that the parties are more and more reaching what we call alternative dispute resolution techniques, mediation, and that sort of thing.
So you gained a reputation for settling cases, as in the case of a New York insurance company and a severe injury case that was scheduled for a week-long trial. The company had not paid the $1 million limit policy.
Oh, yeah. It was a case where liability was very clear, and all the parties admitted it. They were simply holding out, and after getting together with the attorneys at a settlement conference, I became convinced that they should pay the policy limits and probably would get stuck for a good bit more if they didn't pay this $1 million. So I called, got in touch with the executive himself, talked with him, and after visiting with him, not a very long period of time, he said, "Where you want me to send this $1 million check?"
Man, it just took a 5-minute phone call, maybe, where it could have been a long
saved
trial.
A lot of money. They'd have spent a terrible amount of that money on the trial itself.
In Oklahoma, we had one of the largest public corruption scandals in American history, and that's the corrupt county commissioners. 162 current and former county commissioners, 62 suppliers were either found guilty or they pled guilty and sentenced by federal judges in Oklahoma City, Tulsa, and Muskogee. Dorothy Griffin, a lumber company owner, you might want to take it from there. Tell us what she was doing.
She owned a little lumber company in Ferris, Oklahoma, which is not very far from Antlers, where I grew up. Sometime during the course of an investigation, Bill Price, U.S. attorney, he discovered, and she willingly conceded, that she had been acting as a front to pay kickbacks to county commissioners for ordering materials that sometimes never were delivered or in reduced amounts. When it started, it just bloomed, and many county commissioners were charged. Almost all of them pleaded guilty. One, Ralph Adair, was acquitted. Andy Coates defended him, and he was acquitted, but almost every one of them were convicted. And as a consequence, we had a large number of pleas and plea agreements to approve and be involved with.
And Dorothy Griffin was to be sentenced by you.
I did finally sentence her and gave her a very lenient sentence because she had been under a very serious threat during that entire period of time that all of this was being prepared and going forward before it'd be revealed. She had been absolutely forthcoming. I can't remember exactly, but it was a very lenient sentence, all at the request of the U.S. Attorney's Office, an appreciation for the cooperation that she had given them.
So did she do a year, 2 years? Or what?
I really just can't remember, but
yeah.
It was light.
You didn't have any backlash.
No, that
hadn't been for her.
Oh, it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened. And back then, they didn't criticize you quite as quickly for a lenient sentence as they seem to now, in my opinion.
This would have been in the 80s.
Yeah.
You spoke of her under threat. What about you? Did you receive threats?
You know, I really haven't received hardly any serious threat. I've received some very nasty phone calls and things of that nature, some of which turned out to be kind of comical. But I got a letter from an old boy who was in prison. The letter said, "Dear West, I'm going to kill you." And it was signed by his former mother-in-law. They quickly traced it to him. He'd written that, and he later was tried and convicted of threatening a federal officer. But I almost felt sorry for him. If you can't try to involve your former mother-in-law, who can you involve? But at any rate, nothing very serious, although we received enormous numbers of calls when I ruled that the no-call list, as passed by the FTC, was not legal and had to be done by the FCC. Boy, that blew the lid off. We got millions of calls. It just shut down the courthouse almost. The no-call list, the FTC passed a regulation saying that if you wrote them and got on this list, companies couldn't make solicitation calls. You know, they always called you right at dinner time. It was issued and, in effect, had millions of people on it, 31 million or something like that. And I ruled that the agency that issued that regulation was not the proper agency, but that the sister agency, FCC, had the jurisdiction in that area, and that the one that had been issued was invalid. Well, the Congress almost immediately met in outrage and got the bill corrected so that supposedly now there is an effective no-call list. But boy, in the meantime, they really got upset and, as I say, shut down the courthouse almost with irate calls. I got letters from people saying, you're just like Osama bin Laden. You're one of the two most hated men in the world. And I was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. Got a lot of bad publicity. Jay Leno listed my name and phone number on the Jay Leno show and invited everybody to call me. So you can imagine how many people called and were upset. I've got a letter or two, which I won't bother to read to you, but some of them were absolutely classics.
You were in that position. Why was it you were the judge?
Well, I just drew the case. It came to me. That wasn't a field of expertise for me, certainly. But when it came down, some of these people that did want the list to be effective brought suit. I got it on the draw, and fell heir to it. It was pretty tough.
But the FCC took control of it, and it still works.
It's still working now,
right.
Well as any regulation.
The Penn Square Bank failure. The bank made questionable loans, attracted bankers and investors from all across the nation. So Penn Square Bank was a virtual backdoor for large banks to get in on the oil boom. And then a sudden drop in oil prices, and that's when the Penn Square Bank fails, and so do other large banks.
They effectively loaned money without justifiable security. And it was even joked and kidded that they loaned money to people that didn't even want to borrow money from them. But that was a big debacle. We refer to it as a Penn State debacle.
And many civil lawsuits and criminal prosecution, of course. But you took the bull by the horns, should I say, because you summoned these officials to your chambers. Let's talk about that a moment. There was the 75 lawsuits involving Longhorn Oil and Gas.
That's right. That was one of the companies that had borrowed enormous amounts of money and could not even come close to repaying those. I got them all together and just talked to them about the format of trying to resolve these disputes somewhat uniformly, if it could be done, as opposed to going to trial seriatim on 75 different lawsuits, at the end of which they probably couldn't collect all or whatever they had come into. Sure enough, it worked. Not all of those cases were mine, but most of them were, and so we settled them all.
Names that come to mind: Executive Vice President William G. Patterson.
Bill Patterson was a young man. He was a high-profile officer of the bank out there that had gotten all sorts of publicity about how he had encouraged people to borrow money and help them attain larger loans. He was tried for bank fraud on his own bank, of which he owned considerable stock and lost an enormous amount of money himself in. He was charged criminally. Burke Bailey defended him. I tried that case, in which he was acquitted of all charges after it was over. Funny thing about that, Burke first asked that some of the charges be dismissed, and I indicated that I was prepared to dismiss them for lack of evidence, but he withdrew that. And I asked him, I said, why did you do that, Burke? And he said, because I wanted all the charges to be presented. They were just throwing mud on the wall. In my recollection, they had maybe a couple of charges that made pretty good sense. He'd rather have the jury pass on all of those. And sure enough, they acquitted him on all those charges. Mm-hmm. He later was involved in Continental Illinois Bank up in Illinois. He was charged criminally up there. First, there was a hung jury, and then he later pled guilty, largely because I think he was almost out of resources to defend any further. But he did plead guilty, served some time, and I think he still lives in Oklahoma City as a lawn mowing service or some such.
And then there's Clark Long, former officer of the bank.
That was the only officer that was convicted, I believe, and he was tried in my court.
And he was arrested after a chase through the very prestigious Nichols Hills.
Yeah, that's right. I do remember that. We had another notorious Nichols Hills defendant, Pody Poe, lived out there and ran a gaming operation apparently for some considerable time, or a numbers deal. He was in constant trouble.
You took on the issue of abuse by law enforcement officers, and you believe federal judges are in a unique position, have an obligation to prevent abuse by law enforcement.
Well, I do feel strongly, and I've voiced my concern about it, that we have to be careful. Of all people, we need to guard against defendants being taken advantage of. It's really an easy thing to do if you're a judge or if you're a law enforcement person to abuse and mistreat people. There's not very many people who will stand up for them. Most people, as you know, a lot of people feel if they're in jail, they deserve to be treated harshly and badly, and they're not very concerned about that. And I think federal judges have a special role to play in attempting to prevent that from happening. That's just personal.
We may point out an example here, as in the withholding of documents in the Oklahoma City bombing trial of Timothy McVeigh.
Brady versus Maryland is the name of the Supreme Court decision that requires the government to provide any document or any information that they discovered with all their resources that might be helpful to the defendant or supportive of any defense that he might have. That law, Brady versus Maryland, I'm afraid to say, is fairly frequently not abided by fully and completely. I think the prosecutors get a competitive, combative sense of mind, and they just don't often turn over things that they should.
Well, I interviewed Stephen Jones in this website, and he talked about that, the withholding of documents. So you were very much aware of all that.
I was and am concerned about it still, although I'm not trying any criminal cases anymore.
Is this your term, civic murder?
Yeah, I've used that to aggravate my colleagues. By that, I simply meant that if we aren't very careful, the government will execute someone who didn't commit the crime. To me, if the system permits that, that's civic murder. I mean, that's one of the worst things we can do, is to allow or permit someone to be executed for a crime that they didn't commit. And that's why I really feel we need to be very careful about allowing them to exercise all the rights that they have under the law and should have.
Because we have executed innocent people.
Oh, we have executed them. I think it's still possible to do so. You know, Illinois passed a law. They quit executing them just because they found out. And I think the same thing could happen here in the state.
Now, in more recent times, with DNA evidence, that's helped to resolve some of that.
It has. And this Innocence Project has been a big help in that regard, too.
As a settlement judge, you were asked in 2002 to settle the case of the Black Tulsa police officers. That suit had been going on since 1994.
Our friend Susan Savage was the mayor of the city of Tulsa during most or all of that time. At least she was when we resolved that case. And we simply just hammered out between representatives of the police, the Fraternal Order of Police, and the city and the litigants, a policy that would allow them to continue and do that other than by litigation. It's not easy. Those are really difficult chores to get done, but we were able to work out a settlement after a long-winded case. I'll mention one other. Out in New Mexico, I went out there at the request of the judge. They had a case been going on for 9 years in which each side had spent more than $25 million on attorney's fees and costs, and it wasn't even quite ready for trial yet. They were expected to spend $60 million on each side. I went out there with Cindy, my law clerk, on Tuesday morning, and we caught a plane back on Thursday. We were able to get that resolved, and that resulted in a good bit of publicity for the summary jury trial and settlement, alternative dispute resolution techniques.
There must be also maybe something about your personality that you're able to bring to play on this, you think?
I don't know whether I have unusual ability, but if I do have any, it probably comes from traveling with my father, the itinerant horse trader, as a young man in southeastern Oklahoma. And then Roger Fisher wrote a book. He's a Harvard law prof. He wrote a little book called Getting to Yes. And I think it's the attitude toward trying to resolve a dispute and to help persuade the parties if your views might help to resolve that dispute. More importantly, to get them to accept that as opposed to a winner-take-all type thing. And I've always believed that. I've worked at that pretty hard, and I have had good luck.
In 1978, you received the Outstanding Achievement Award from the Aero Club of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I don't know. That was primarily because I was acting chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board. I don't think there's anything significant about my contribution to the Civil Aeronautics Board.
Okay, I'll give you that, but then maybe there's something more significant or interesting on how you got to the White House and what you drove up in.
Okay, that's a story that, although true, has been frequently cited and quoted. I received an invitation from the Ford White House to attend a dinner at the White House. Marianne desperately wanted to go. Since I say she's very social, I was really a little bit reluctant to do it, but I finally thought I'd persuade her not to. I said, I'll go on one condition, that I can drive my old pickup up there. And it didn't bother her a bit. She's perfectly willing to do that. So we went to that White House dinner in a 72 Dodge Club Cab pickup. As we were pulling in, the crowds were all hooping and hollering, and the guards were smiling, and we were the only pickup in the line. That was before Carter, so there wasn't any other pickups there. We were the only one there. They got word of it in the news media. Alan Cromley, I believe, was the White House correspondent, and they published it in the paper. So it's gotten an inordinate amount of publicity, but it was a fun deal, really.
The security had to be looking at this twice and three times.
They didn't understand it at all. They just couldn't hardly believe it, but there wasn't any basis for them to reject me, so they let me through. And the guards couldn't help but smile. You know, they had a whole lineup of military guards, and they all got a kick out of it as well.
Your courtroom is always interesting, as in the trial for defendant Alfred James Prince, who's accused of robbing a Duncan, Oklahoma savings and loan.
Alfred J. Prince was a big, sturdy, young African-American who robbed a savings and loan down there, which made it a federal offense. They captured him at Chickasha as he was trying to escape. We had a very outstanding young black attorney with our defense setup here, and I appointed him to represent him. He was a good lawyer. They got along just fine at first, and then shortly before the trial was scheduled to start, the attorney came in and said, Judge, I need to be released from that. And I said, why? And he said, well, Alfred J. Prince, he's been over there in the city jail and talking to all these lawyers. He wants to file a bunch of really frivolous motions that I can't represent him on as an officer of the court. And when I told him that, he quit talking with me. He said he won't communicate with me. So I said, well, I'll give him a hearing and let him sort of explain. But he's entitled to a lawyer, and I've appointed him a good lawyer. He can't pick and choose among the lawyers that he wants. We got him in the courtroom, and he refused to speak to me. Even he just remained mute. So on the morning that we were scheduled for trial, we had the jurors in there and brought him in. As we were attempting to voir dire the jurors, ask them about their qualifications, he stood, dropped his trousers, and attempted to urinate on defense counsel. He didn't hit him, but he just kind of covered the counsel table and the floor and everything. Well, we got the jurors out of there, and I tried to talk with him a little bit about demeanor, and it wasn't registering. So I sent him to Springfield to find out if this was contrived or whether he was really suffering some mental difficulties. And in the meantime, I got all sorts of gifts from my colleagues. They gave me hip boots and shower caps. And Springfield finally determined up there that he was motivated to do this. It was not any mental deficiency, that it was calculated and designed. So we did go ahead and try him, and he was convicted. And the circuit court, in their opinion, wrote a kind of clever comment. They said incontinence was not equivalent to incompetence in the Western District of Oklahoma, something to that effect. Alfred J. Prince. The worst thing about that was that Andy Coates, my dear friend Andy Coates, dean of the law school, he went all around the state telling everybody that Alfred J. Prince was his hero. he said he not only exercised his First Amendment rights in expressing his opinion of Judge West's court, but he represented about 95% of the lawyers who has ever appeared in Judge West's court. And I have no defense for that.
One more. In 1982, you had the case involving the counterfeit E.T. doll, the stuffed versions of the extraterrestrial in Steven Spielberg's movie. And you got that case.
I remember I granted an injunction to enjoin them from violating that copyright trademark. They stopped them out here. It was during the fair, I think, the state fair, as a matter of fact.
So did you have the E.T. doll?
I had the E.T. doll at the hearing, of course.
You and Robert Henry, who was on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, now president of Oklahoma City University, you've had a friendly debate about who is superior, you, a trial judge, or he, an appellate judge.
We have. We've done that several times, and it was always a lot of fun for me because I not only had the easy side of the question, that trial judges were better, but they put me in that knife fight with rather a dull blade, being Robert Henry, which I say, of course, in jest because he's one of the most brilliant and bright and compelling guys I'm acquainted with. We've done that on several different occasions, including before the American College of Trial Lawyers down at Boca Raton. It's all in fun and all in jest, but it's really very good. One thing I will say about him, I was on the program when he was anointed as a federal circuit judge. They listed me as giving defamatory remarks, which I did the best I could. But I noted that I was a chief judge in assigning spaces here in the courthouse. I put him in an interior office with no bathroom facilities and no windows so that he would more quickly assume the attitude of appellate judges. Of course, I was the very first trial judge that he reversed when he got on the circuit court. And he likes to tell about that, too.
Well, I suppose those of us who sit outside and view that being a trial judge perhaps could be more interesting than an appellate who just really reviews cases.
Oh, to me, it's much more fun. And I've done both. Been on the trial judge state and federal level, and I've served on the appellate court and on the state appellate court. To me, it is more fun. Now, it's certainly not any more important than the circuit judgeship, but here you deal with people. I mean, you deal with more people, and they do have to deal more with the cold record and with the attorneys that present that. I can't tell you how impressed I am with the job that they do and have, but just in terms of personal enjoyment, I much prefer. I was a candidate for both circuit and federal court bench, and they were asking me then, which one of those jobs do you want? And I said, the first one they offer me, and that was the truth. But Stephanie was appointed, proved to be an outstanding circuit judge, and I was lucky enough to get this job, and I believe they did best in that regard.
I just want to ask you about Marion Opala, who I interviewed for this.
Oh, Marion and I were close friends for over 50 years. His is the most unbelievable story of all the people I know just about. He's brilliant. Of course, everybody knew and recognized that. He was a wonderful, wonderful scholar and a good, honest, very, very honest, straightforward fella. He was the court administrator when I was on the state court, and I complained bitterly because he was always recommending me for these difficult, high-profile cases. But we were closest friends, good friends, and had lunch, well, on a monthly basis, at any rate, until he died. Had lunch with him 4 or 5 days before he died, as a matter of fact. He's an amazing man.
I interviewed him 4 days before he died.
I read that somewhere.
Yeah. To think, coming out of Poland at 19 and that story.
From Lodes to Oklahoma City, it's kind of like I said, from Antlers, Oklahoma to the White House, even if it's only for dinner. And I'll tell you what, he made a contribution everywhere. He was a good workman's comp judge. He was a workman's comp judge and did extremely well, and then was appointed to the Supreme Court later. Good man.
While you're a judge, you're an avid outdoorsman, an animal trainer. You've bred and trained many championship bird dogs throughout the years. Your dogs have been enshrined in the Field Trial Hall of Fame. Your dogs have all won national championships. You've derived a lot of satisfaction from the outdoors and dogs.
Indeed, and I think it's really important, a point to make is that you need to have a balanced life and existence. Almost everyone I know on the federal bench at any level have been or are somewhat workaholics at some time of their life, a good deal. But I do believe, I always tell everybody, you ought to marry a woman that'll stay married with you 50 years or more. And even though that advice may become late, it's still good advice. You just have to live a little longer. But I do believe that it's really important to have something aside and apart from the work, which I really enjoy doing, but you've got to have an outlet and relief. It doesn't make any difference what it is, golf or whatever. You need to do that, or you don't do either as well, in my opinion.
Let's give honor to the best dog you believe you ever owned.
Okay, I would say Barshu Buzzsaw, whose painting is right there.
It's right above your
He's
chair.
in the Hall of Fame, as is his sire, Buckboard, who's here behind me. They were both great dogs, but I would choose him if I had to pick one of the two. There was another great young dog called Curmudgeon who died at an early age that would probably have been better, but he just didn't live quite long.
What was so great about Barshu?
Everything. He had strength, endurance, intelligence, class. Everything he did was sort of poetry and motion. Great bird finder, everything. He's hard to improve on, and that's why he's in the Field Trial Hall of Fame.
Being a dog lover myself, I'm not a hunter, my son is, but those who have never had a relationship with a dog are missing out in one of life's true delights.
Will Rogers said it best. He said, if there are no dogs in heaven, I want to go where the dogs are. And I think there's a great deal of truth to that.
Yeah. Students will be listening to this conversation in many, many years to come and generations. And so your advice to students of the law, to those who want to be a judge, what do you say to these young people?
Well, I sincerely believe that the legal profession is a great profession. We don't always encounter good publicity or good public acceptance, but lawyers and judges are here to help people resolve disputes instead of resorting to violence or some other form of taking advantage of each other. And I believe that's an honorable occupation. I love lawyers. I've been around them all my life. To me, they're the most delightful people in the world to associate with on a regular basis. And I think what they do is very, very important. And what we do is an important job. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it now for 40 years.
And here you are, soon to be 82.
82.
And you have senior status as a federal judge. How are you involved, that senior status?
I did decline criminal cases simply because they're longer, more time-consuming, and because I had some disagreement at the time with the sentencing guidelines, which have since been changed a little bit, but I have started taking them. I am involved in all sorts of civil cases of any kind and every kind, class actions and personal injury actions, all of those things. I do a substantial number of settlement conferences and protracted and difficult cases for the other judges. I've got a full staff, as I say, and I'm here every day. My staff has to work a little harder to keep me between the fence posts, but I'm still doing it, and I enjoy it very, very much.
You know, it's amazing. When you were on the CAB or federal bench and so forth, do you ever pinch yourself and say, I know where I came from?
Yeah, you can't help but, and I just look upon myself as being extremely fortunate. I mean, this is not the greatest paying job in the world, but it's a job I enjoy coming to every day, and that's very important. I think about it, you know, my father couldn't read or write. My mother could barely read or write. I had a lot of help along the way from some really very nice people to allow me to do what I love doing. And I tell you what, I just couldn't be more grateful to all of them, because without them it wouldn't have been. As a lawyer, if you've got a good memory, if you work pretty hard, and if you're blessed as I am, I'm an expert plagiarist, you know, so if you do that, you can do pretty well and enjoy yourself. For 40 years, I've been on the bench, state and federal, state Supreme Court, appellate court, and I've enjoyed every step of it. It's been a good trip, and I've been very fortunate.
How would you like to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered as someone who was very competent as a judge, enjoyed what he was doing, and loved doing it. I don't think you can be a good judge unless you like being a judge, and nobody's ever accused me of not enjoying. I think you got to have a little fun. I have a good friend, Austin lawyer, by the name of John Harmon, and he said, if it's not fun, it's not worth doing. That's pretty profound as far as I'm concerned. So I have always, even at the risk sometime of behaving a little ridiculously, tried to enjoy what I was doing, and I've tried to make the people around me enjoy it as much as possible, lawyers and litigants and everything else.
So, Honorable Lee West, I want to thank you. Students and all for generations to come, they thank you as well, and thank you for what you meant to our country and our state.
John, that's very kind, and as I told you before, no one enjoys talking about themselves any more than I do, so I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you.